Hello, good afternoon. My name is Alejandro Reyes. I'm a visiting professor with the University of Hong Kong. I've actually been visiting for 7 years, so it's a very long visit. Now, it's my job to keep you occupied after 2 very intense sessions and to keep you interested after lunch, which is always a rather difficult task. Especially, we're going to talk about global governance, which isn't entirely the most sexy topic for after lunch, and that's probably the first time anybody used the word sexy with G20, but we're going to try to do it. But to put it in a bit of context, we've talked about the global competitiveness and opportunities in Asia this morning, taking a regional perspective, looking mainly at cities, and then we focused on China. So now, essentially, we're stepping up. We're going to take a global perspective, having done the regional and the China perspective. Now, one might ask, well, why? I mean, if you think about global competitiveness and opportunities, many of the obstacles to maintaining competitiveness, to developing competitiveness, to maintaining growth in this region and elsewhere around the world, really, there are many global challenges, global issues that confront us that could be threats to that growth. I just noted down some of the challenges that were mentioned this morning, food security, energy security, if you think about climate change, financial regulation, youth unemployment, skills development, access to pharmaceuticals, public health, and such. These are issues that require sort of global solutions or regional solutions and national solutions. And so it's very important to think about, well, what is our approach at the global level, especially in the context of the global financial crisis. If you think about the role that the G20 played in addressing the collapse of the global economy, that the concerted effort by the G20 was perhaps well noted as being an important aspect of preventing the financial system from truly collapsing. So it's very important for us to think about how global governance is dealing with the challenges we face to growth. Now, I'm one of those that Ronnie mentioned, coming from Southeast Asia with an elite educational background, but I think I do get the point of governance. And so we will talk about the importance of global governance, the importance of national governance, and also look at regional institutions as well. We have a very good panel for this, if I might say so. To my immediate right is Janaline Oh, who is the Deputy Consul-General of Australia, and she is the former Director of G20 projects in the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade of Australia. To her right is Dr. Jesus Seade, the Vice President and the long Chair of Economics at Lingnan University, and he's the founding Deputy Director General of the WTO. To his right is Dr. Anup Singh, the Managing Director and Head of Regulatory Strategy and Policy, Asia Pacific at JP Morgan, and the former Director of the Asia Department, International Monetary Fund. And to his right is Dr. Alan Bollard, the Executive Director of the APEC Secretariat. So before I start, just to thank Dr. Singh and JP Morgan and the Asia Society for this panel and for your participation. So if I might start with Janaline, since we're focused on the G20 to start, I'm wondering if you could talk a little about Australia being the president of the G20 this year. What is Australia hoping to achieve? And also, how is Australia, with its G20 presidency, trying to shore up, if you will, the credibility and the legitimacy of the G20 as an institution of global governance? I think it should be.
Sorry, is this? Yes, it's working. Sorry, I'm not very technically competent. Well, I'm very interested to hear, I'm afraid I wasn't here for this morning's session, but I was very interested to hear Al's articulation of the list of important global challenges, because every one of those challenges actually appears in Australia's G20's priorities list. Now, because one of the things that we're trying not to do with the G20 is to make it save the world and solve every possible problem, some of them are getting more emphasis than others, but certainly they are all part of a general strategy which is very much focused on economic growth and development, and very much focused on removing impediments to that growth and development. And by that, those sorts of means, we're hoping to be able to improve agricultural productivity, to lift some of the barriers to food security. And, you know, some of the problems with food security are actually in the delivery. So, you know, trade becomes an important issue in that respect. You know, we're looking at climate financing, we're looking to consolidate the initiatives that the G20 took on financial regulation immediately after the global financial crisis. We're looking at measures to improve employment and participation, and we're actually having a meeting of Labor and Employment Ministers to discuss this issue with a particular focus on women and youth. And we're also looking at energy governance and how to make everybody feel more secure about their energy. So, I mean, these are all issues that are very important. In terms of legitimacy, I mean, I think the G20 really had a starring role in the global financial crisis, or in the immediate aftermath. I mean, the leaders got together in London, you know, they all talked about this terrible crisis, they found some solutions, they got agreement, and it was really a it was the high point for the G20. It really proved its worth because it's not the G7, because it has broad participation. Since then, I think G20 has become a bit of a victim of its own success, in that people saw, wow, it did so well in the financial crisis. Let's make it solve my problem. And so I think the agenda has tended to expand a little bit. So one of the things, again, that Australia is trying to do in this year, in its presidency, is to consolidate that, to really look at where we should be consolidating what we've already started and where we should be moving forward in a realistic but ambitious way. And so that's why we've looked at we've asked ourselves the question, what actually can G20 leaders do? What can they deliver? And I think we came to the conclusion of what they can deliver is their own governments and their own government's commitment to domestic reform and domestic action. And so we're asking countries to come up with growth strategies to achieve the target that I think our finance ministers and central bank governors recently put out of increasing global growth by 2 percentage points above business as usual within the next 5 years. Ambitious, yes. By taking their own actions to get their own houses in order. So I think that's how we're hoping both to deal with our priorities and also to shore up the G20's legitimacy, because at the end of the day, the G20 has no legitimacy unless it can deliver.
Thank you very much. Janaline, can I follow up a little bit? Because at the World Economic Forum annual meeting in Davos in January, Prime Minister Abbott, who's making his debut, if you will, as the G20 president, spoke of his priorities for the Australian presidency. And one of them was to finish up all the financial reforms that the G20 started. And he was very adamant about that. This can be done, you know, the too big to fail issue and all of that. And yet, we see some of the reforms that were initiated by the G20, particularly with regard to the IMF quotas, stall. So I'm wondering, what realistically do you think Australia can do on the financial reform side, which would be of great interest to an audience in Hong Kong?
Yes, the Prime Minister did articulate a very ambitious agenda to tie up financial regulation reform, and that remains our priority. I think certainly on the issues of globally systemically important institutions, I think we are making some progress, and I think that our recent meeting of finance ministers and central bank governors helped that process. With respect to the IMF reforms, everybody knows that what is holding up the IMF reform implementation is the US Congress. And unfortunately, neither Prime Minister Abbott nor any of the other G20 leaders, including President Obama, is in a position to force the Congress to do anything. But we are encouraged that the President and the Treasury Secretary have demonstrated their own personal commitment to moving this forward, and that there is debate going on. So we are hopeful that there will be movement in the US. Because, I think everybody agrees that the IMF is terrifically important, and nobody wants to see the IMF go backwards. Everybody wants to see the IMF become more representative. And so, yes, we are working on it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. If I might move to Dr. Siadet, and talk a little bit about your experience in the WTO, and the fact that you've also been in the IMF, so you have quite a range of experience in global governance institutions. What are your thoughts on the G20 and its legitimacy? It gained a lot of credibility, as Janaline mentioned, in reacting to the crisis, but now that we're some years after the crisis, that there are questions now about the sustainability of the G20 and even its legitimacy.
I'm not sure about the legitimacy, but certainly the need for G20. I'm a great fan. To me, one of the great developments after the financial crisis, the silver lining around the crisis, was the tremendous burst of international cooperation that came out of it, with President Bush convening the G20 for the first time at the summit level, and establishing it at the summit level, and linking it to the Financial Stability Forum that had been central since the aftermath of the Asian financial crisis in dealing with financial issues. So it really looked like you were beginning to have a central piece of the international financial architecture at the highest level, well attended. And this continued a year later, if I'm not mistaken, was the London summit of the G20, and again, big things were done. And but my feeling is that since then it has lost focus. I mean, it continues to meet, it continues to do useful things. The Financial Stability Board continues to oversee what's going on with the Basel process and with other areas of financial regulation developments. Not everything has developed, but I think generally the regulation agenda has more or less moved forward. But the G20, my feeling is that should have become a more important, more like the G8 used to be. I'm not sure if it still is. We seem not to have a focus, a place where heads of government of the most important economies have their fireside chats to coordinate policies on the right thing. And I think a strong G20, my feeling is that it has lost some steam, and that it is a very important thing. Now, legitimacy has to be earned by themselves. So these are only, I think it's 19 economies, right? The 20 is a European Union.
There's a wild card.
19 countries in the European Union. They don't represent all the other 180 or so, but they have to speak for them. They have to invite countries that are particularly affected when an issue is being discussed. They have to have a fora for consultation. In any case, they don't come to any final decisions. They only set direction, which is then executed by the IMF, by the World Bank, by the BIS, and those are multilateral. So I'm not too worried about legitimacy if they play their cards well, and I haven't seen much problem on that. Maybe I may have missed something, but I haven't seen much rejection by countries that are not members. So that's not the issue. The issue is it still really owning the souls and the determination of the membership at the presidential head of government level? I think it should.
Now, talking about global institutions that have lost steam, you were with WTO,
Yes.
and of course this in many ways is more in people's minds. You know, the Doha round, it keeps on going and going, and maybe going nowhere. So I'm wondering if you could bring us into, I mean, this is clearly not the golden age of global governance. We're not living in the golden age of global governance. So what's the problem with the WTO? Is it that it's too democratic? Is it it's too many members? Lowest common denominator solutions? I'm wondering if you could give us some insight.
Yeah, not too many members. I mean, it has to have universal membership to the extent possible, but certainly many members. I think that's a key element. I really, I'm not a believer in the Doha round. I'm a great believer in multilateralism. I absolutely believe that what the Doha round is trying to achieve in agriculture, in industrial products access, in improving rules of the game, anti-dumping and subsidies, in all these areas, development, all that is super important. But I don't think the Doha round is going to deliver. And I think it's at least 5 years or so that I have been saying it should close down. And I think the fact that countries continue to keep it alive is a major hindrance to real advance, because nothing is happening. You just have a zombie there, and the zombie is neither dying nor moving forward. In my opinion, the Doha round was not very well designed from the beginning. There are two problems that I see. One, that it was never demanded by anybody. It was a negotiator's concoction. You have had a terribly difficult round, the previous one. You should not underestimate how hard this was. It failed completely 3 times. It was about to be called off. In the end, it succeeded as a miracle, created a WTO. And negotiators and authorities, trade authorities in capitals got excited and said, oh, let's have more, without, I think, without enough reflection. Within 2 years of the end of the creation of WTO, there were already meetings. The Doha round is called Doha round, but in fact, the process doesn't go back to 2001, which is the Doha meeting. It goes back to 1997 or so, when countries began to cajole and to meet and to try to propose this. Without responding to market needs. The Uruguay round was really demanded by the private sector. And I'm a great believer in public function. The role of government is to do what is right and not what the private sector does exclusively. Nevertheless, it is certainly very useful to have a demand to which you respond. During the Uruguay round, the private sector was intensely in the picture, intensely, as much as the official sector. You had in Geneva, all kinds of business people from all over the world constantly lobbying and finding out and things, and also from the labor sector and the like. In the Doha round, I know it from people in the system, there's been just not one businessman, except with a camera here, that has been trying to find out what's going on. So it didn't respond to needs. And the needs are correctly assessed by the authorities, but you need to respond to needs. You need to have the political base. And secondly, the main achievement, I would say it on the score, the main achievement of the Uruguay round was not so much agriculture or intellectual property or this or that, was the universalization of the participation. Before that, you had much fewer countries members. All the developing countries had an exception regime, so they were not really very involved. So decisions were mainly taken by Europeans and Americans, in private conversation, then sold to the Japanese, the Canadians, then to Brazil, to Mexico, to India. China was not part of it. No, it's not part. So the process was illegitimate, but feasible, concentric, from the Europeans and Americans to everybody else. The great achievement was that in intellectual property, agreements that signed by 12 countries became signed by 100 countries, and on agriculture and everything. Well, that meant that everybody was very interested, but there was no adjustment on the question of participation, and so the Doha round was non-feasible, I think, from the beginning. Too difficult. You need to orchestrate something like a G20 to lead it. You need a process to lead it. And it was deprived of that from the beginning.
Now, we've heard a lot about the Bali package that was agreed, particularly the trade facilitation measures included in it that was agreed at the end of last year. Now, that's generated a lot of hope, so much so that in the trade ministers meeting in Davos, there was a lot of discussion about how the Bali package could be a catalyst for moving the round forward, and that maybe we can talk about coalitions of the willing strategies. There was some maybe irrational exuberance about the Doha round after that. I'm wondering what, just briefly, your thoughts on the impact of the Bali package.
The Bali package was very valuable as a mega fig leaf to protect the WTO from terminal loss of prestige. It's a useful agreement. It improves, it creates commitments to improve, to facilitate customs, easier customs procedures, and transparency. Those two, basically. So it was a good thing to achieve. Nothing major, nothing that remotely touches on the difficult areas that prevented progress in the Doha round. Nothing to do with agriculture negotiation, with anti-dumping, with all the other things. I don't think it is a major step forward in terms of the Doha process. It is a very useful step forward for the WTO, but I don't think it really changes anybody's assessment, and anything else was rhetoric, I would say.
Thank you. Dr. Singh, if I might come back to the financial architecture and the G20's attempts to reform it, but also just the IMF's role itself. I'm wondering if you could just comment sort of briefly on where you see the financial architecture reform since the crisis, and are we stalled, or is that ambitious goal of Australia's to sort of wrap everything up this year? Is that possible?
Well, I think we've come a long way in the last 5 years, and the G20 is clearly taking it forward. About the IMF reform, let me just make a few points. As you said, it's taken a while to get the 14th review of quotas implemented, and that has two consequences. Let me just spend a few minutes on that. It was being done for two reasons. One was to raise the lending power and the capital resources of the IMF. Meanwhile, that lending power has not been diminished because the IMF has been able to borrow bilaterally on a temporary basis from a number of countries, most of whom are emerging markets. So although we are waiting for the quota review to be completed, until it is completed, the lending capacity of the IMF remains almost as it would be were the quota review to be completed. But perhaps most importantly, we do know that the bilateral temporary lending agreements that gives the IMF this capital in the short run is very important. Much of it comes from emerging markets. And therefore, it's worth for a second to look at global economic governance and see how the IMF would change when the quota review gets completed. It's important because the share of emerging markets and developing countries will significantly rise in the IMF. What it means is that the 4 BRIC countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, will become among the 10 largest shareholders of the IMF, and China, for example, would become the 3rd largest shareholder of the IMF. So there are these factors. And until this is, and when this is completed, it will mean that the voting share of, say, the United States and the European Union will drop below 50%. So there are important changes in governance taking place. But what I do want to emphasize is looking at the lending capacity that continues, I believe, for the IMF because of these bilateral borrowing agreements. You asked me a second comment.
Yes, no,
on the
in
G20.
terms of the aim of the G20 to pursue
Yes.
further, particularly if we put it in, look at the context of, okay, we've gone through the crisis, we've rescued the global economy, and now we're in the midst of this unwinding of the stimulus.
Yes.
And how are we doing in terms
Yes,
of
we've come a
coordination?
long way. I think the G20 should take the credit for having asked for a global fiscal stimulus in 2008. It was led by the G20. What it meant was that the world avoided a global recession. That was a major achievement. It was proposed by the G20, and it was done, including significantly by China, because the world realized that the results of coordination in policies is huge. The world is so interconnected that unless countries coordinate their policies, the result is suboptimal. Since then, the G20 moved to financial restructuring, rebuilding the financial system, and resisting contagion. Now the G20 has moved rightly to developing a growth strategy for the world. And we're in what is called tapering. Just on that moment, let me just make one point, and that is the G20 came together in fiscal policy for the fiscal stimulus. The G20 came together with the Financial Stability Board and other institutions on the financial restructuring that is needed. However, all this has been done, especially the fiscal stimulus, because after the financial crisis, global demand fell, aggregate demand fell, and the world needs demand in order for growth to revive. It's taking us longer. Now, because it's taking longer for aggregate demand to revive, we are in a historic time because we have central banks taking on in advanced economies, the Fed, the ECB, and the Bank of Japan, taking on what is now called unconventional monetary policies. And they've taken on unconventional monetary policies with monetary easing of a scale, quantity, and quality that we have never seen before historically. Even economics, the theory of economics has not been able to explain where we are now. So we are really, the reason I'm saying this is central banks are dealing with domestic mandates. They're dealing with what is their role in their countries. But what is now the case is that this unconventional monetary policy has huge policy transmissions across the world. It means that as money goes in search of risk and yield, money flows out. And now with tapering happening, money is flowing back. What this means is that the G20 can and should do more to examine the implications of unconventional monetary policy, because this has huge consequences for the rest of the world. Let me give you one small example. Countries are now afraid, emerging markets, that money is going to flow out. So what do? They're trying to become stronger to resist the implications. They're trying to resist having current account deficits. They're trying to resist having fiscal deficits. They're trying to increase their own reserves because they're afraid of the consequences of tapering, which are also a consequences of the exit from unconventional monetary policy. What this means in the end is emerging markets are holding back aggregate demand. What this means is this prolongs the time it takes for global demand to recover. So what I'm saying is the G20 has done a lot. They now need to do more in examining the consequences, the implications of unconventional monetary policies.
Now, I want to put you on the spot, Ben. do you think they're going to achieve in as much coordination as they had at the initial stage of the crisis? Do you think that the prospects of that kind of coordination that's required with the tapering will happen in the way things are with the G20 today?
Well, if you look at what the G20 said in this last time it met in this communique, they do recognize the policy transmission effects of unconventional monetary policies, and they are asking for much more coordination. The problem is that unconventional monetary policies are rightly conducted by independent central banks that have domestic mandates. So the challenge of the G20 is how do we look at this from a global perspective, and do we see if other policies need to change as a result or as a consequence of what I call unconventional monetary policies. It also helps that the G20, led by Australia, is focusing more this year on growth strategy, because the two are closely interlinked.
Dr. Sari, I kind of backtrack to you, because I think that you might have some insights in your own view on sort of the implications of the taper and what we might see for emerging markets. And are you positive on the G20's role in sort of managing this unwinding of the stimulus?
Well, not really. I mean, Dr. Singh stressed the independence of the central banks, and I think that's really the central issue. The exit, mainly by the largest of all the economies, which is the American economy. I mean, the expansion was coordinated through the G20, and all major countries instrumented policies along these lines, but the one that really affects everybody most deeply and that changed the equilibrium for everybody is the American expansion, and now they are pulling back, broadly speaking, certainly rightly and at the right time, but this changes things dramatically for everybody else. I do agree that the banks are independent. I cannot see things being done much differently by the Americans on this. Maybe they could change a little bit the time and the consultation to make it optimal. Other countries can take measures, and a couple of months can matter. Therefore, consultation is something that has been missing. I think consultation could be not only in the G20 through the G20, because the G20 is going to meet only periodically. It is among the countries, among the authorities. So the members of the G20 should develop an understanding that they're going to relate. Just as we have, for example, concepts like systemically important financial institutions and the like, I think somebody should define systemically important treasuries. And to develop some kind of understanding in the G20, for example, that the effect of policies on others will be taken into account. So to endow the G20 with a capacity that has been done by the IMF to some extent, I believe, to investigate these externalities, the impact across economies. This has been done. There should be more of that. More room for consultation. At the end of the day, it is the central bank, of the Fed's obligation to look after American circumstances, American inflation and growth, and that's what they are doing. But more consultation should certainly should be possible, should be desirable.
Thank you very much. Now, we've gone to talk about the problems confronting global institutions, the G20, the WTO, and the IMF. Now, we have with us Dr. Bollard, the Executive Director of the APEC Secretariat. I'm wondering, Dr. Bollard, if you can focus on the regional solution. Perhaps that's the way forward when you have impasses at the global level, that we should go down a notch and focus at the regional level and see what can be done. Now, there's a lot of discussion about, the regional initiatives in ASEAN, TPP, RCEP, maybe that's the way to go. So from the APEC perspective, I'm wondering if you could give us that view.
Sure, yes, good afternoon. Well, look, some things are global and some are regional, and it really depends where the forces are as to what sort of governance is required and what can help. Actually, I used to run the New Zealand Central Bank, so I was sitting there through all this global financial crisis, and we were absolutely talking about it all around Bank of International Settlements tables and things, but when it came down to it, the Federal Reserve has got a law that the Federal Open Market Committee will follow, and that's in the interests of the United States, of course. That's been a big global impact that's impacted on capital flows right around the world and still is. Actually, there's other big impacts where we've watched China trade lead to big trade impacts right around the world, particularly in this region as well. And I think broadly, as we talk about G20, we shouldn't get unrealistic about what can be expected from them. They've got more moral authority than G8 did. The new IMF should have more moral authority than the old Bretton Woods institutions did. Actually, I'm worried about climate change and who's got the moral authority there. But that doesn't mean that G20 can just do things like that. They can talk about them, and some things absolutely will be done at a regional level, and that's where there's a lot of history. ASEAN, as you've said, has done a huge amount over the last years, since the 1960s, in fact, and next year we'll be putting in place an economic community which has a new, unprecedented level of global value chain interconnectedness around a lot of the ASEAN economies. We are seeing with the Trans-Pacific Partnership a group of like-minded countries trying to put in place a regional agreement which is a leading new generation open trade and investment model. We're seeing with the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership a group of mainly developing economies building on the ASEAN theme. We're seeing with the Pacific Alliance those Latin economies down the Pacific Rim who are most interested in engaging in trade with East Asia, doing some quite innovative things themselves. And then you've got, if you like, the grandfather of it all, which is APEC, which is now in its 25th year. It's the biggest regional body of that sort there is. It's just under half the world's population. It's more than half the world's GDP. And over that period, it has been working through traditional trade liberalisation and then looking at trade facilitation, red tape behind the border sorts of things, and then going back and looking at regulatory reform in economies behind the border, and now looking more and more at how you get across borders through supply chains and connectivity and infrastructure and all those sorts of things. And I agree exactly what you were saying, Professor Riad, with the Bali announcement about trade facilitation. Great, but it doesn't just happen like that. APEC has been struggling away for 25 years with 50 working groups getting together, quarantine officers, customs officers, health officers, immigration officers, private sector people around logistics, around e-commerce, data, privacy, the whole range of things that are actually the practicalities of goods, people, capital and services moving across borders, making a lot of progress, but it's not a straightforward thing at all. So, yes, there's a lot to be done and a lot can be done at regional level, but there's things that you can't do at regional level as well.
Now, to play a little bit devil's advocate, when people ask about what are the achievements of APEC, often I hear, the APEC business card, for example, which facilitates travel around regions, one very concrete achievement that has helped business people. Now, you talked about connectivity, and this was a big theme of the APEC chair last year, Indonesia, and I think the China, which has the chair this year, is also taking up that theme. In particular, how do you improve connectivity in the region through development of infrastructure? I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how, if you just go beyond the APEC business card, it doesn't seem like APEC has really achieved much. And now there's a lot of talk about an Asian infrastructure development investment bank. Is there much to this? Or are we just talking about, we'll work on infrastructure projects together? Will that really happen, particularly given the overlay of geopolitics in this region that may make such cooperation more difficult?
Well, I arrived in Hong Kong this morning. I went through the APEC business travel card queue. There wasn't a queue there, so I just walked straight through. It was just as well because I'd been on planes for the last 30 hours coming from Chile, where all the business of APEC has been meeting, and they're coming up with a whole range of things that they would like ministers to do in APEC. Tomorrow I'll be in Qingdao, which is where a number of the officials' meetings are being held, and we'll have trade ministers meeting there in a week. And they'll be announcing a number of initiatives. I can't tell you what they're going to be right now. You'll have to wait for a week. But they'll also be building up through the year. And then outside Beijing, early November, we'll have all the leaders from the 21 APEC economies who will have some serious announcements. The interesting thing, though, is that unlike, say, the WTO, these are not legally binding things. APEC, interestingly, doesn't have a legal meaning outside Singapore where the Secretariat is. It's voluntary. It doesn't even have country members. It has economy members, 21 of them, basically all the Pacific Rim. And so what happens is people come up with ideas, people come up with pathfinder initiatives, people come up with things that have worked in one economy or a bunch of economies and try them out, and others watch them and then join in or don't join in if they're not working. So actually, yeah, there's been a whole series of things, and I think you're going to see some quite interesting developments over this year, but that's still ahead of us.
Now the fact that it's non-binding and is voluntary, does that mean that APEC is really not a suitable model for global governance, that it won't be all that effective if we look at it as, beyond this kind of ASEAN-style, least common denominator approach, that it's no more than a talking shop?
It's been an incubator for a lot of things where, as I said, particular economies have tried things out and then built on them, and that's given the confidence to some other economies, often developing economies, to come in and try it in a way that they haven't been prepared to do in other more formal organisations. But not everything will work in that sort of format. This year, there's a lot of interest in TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership. Does it go off in one direction with a new generation trade and investment arrangement? Could the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership go off in a different direction? We hope not. One of the things that China would like to see happening this year, during its year of hosting, is to try and get these things on the table and see if they can come together under the free trade area of Asia and the Pacific, which leaders have in principle agreed to, but not really defined as to what that means. We might see that defined much more this year. That would be using APEC more as an integrator as well as an incubator. But there's other things it can't do and shouldn't be the place to do them as well.
Thank you very much. Before I go out to questions from the audience, and I encourage you please to think of questions that you'd like to ask, I just want to go back to Janaline, and I know that you had some thoughts on institutions of regional and global governance that may not include developed economies from the West, and I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that. What your thoughts on how these might be interesting ways to move forward and ensure competitiveness in regions and opportunities.
Before I do that, I really just like to make a little plug for APEC. Not for Alan's benefit, but I mean, as you know, Australia is a very strong and founding supporter of APEC. But when you ask what APEC has achieved, I mean, at the very boring level of harmonising tariff definitions, rules of origin rules between countries, vessel monitoring systems for regional fisheries, APEC has done a tremendous amount of really boring technical work that has actually made goods and services flow more freely across regional borders. So I think, I mean, it's not very exciting to talk about rules of origin, It's
exciting.
It's exciting for WTO, for old WTO hands. But, it's not exciting to talk about the standards of, satellite BIPs for vessel monitoring systems. But it is terrifically important in terms of actually getting fisheries managed in a harmonious way, in having, you know, goods actually pass across borders in a way that every time you cross another border, you don't have to redefine all of your goods. So I think APEC has actually been a real quiet achiever in the international and sort of cooperation space. But with respect to other, I did raise this question with you, and I did specifically say, I am not going to answer this question. Okay. So I think it is extremely mean of you to ask it of me. But the question I raised, and frankly, I would welcome, you know, hearing any views of the people here, because I think a lot of you have a lot more experience and background on these things, as well as my panellists. But one of the questions I raised was, what are the implications for global governance of some of these new organisations that do not include the traditional Western powers, that do not include the United States, do not include the European Union, do not include the United Kingdom? And I'm thinking the Shanghai Cooperation Organisation. I'm thinking the BRICS. The BRICS now have a summit. They're talking about setting up an investment development bank. I mean, they're now coming together and discussing real issues that previously were the preserve of, you know, the 20th century winners of World War II. So I mean, it's a question. It's not something that I want to answer, but it's really just, how does this challenge the existing global order?
I mean for you only to ask the question. Thank you very much. Are there any questions from the floor? Any questions, please? Any comments, questions? Someone back there, no? Mm-hmm. Oh, he was just gesticulating. Just wild gesticulation. We need wild speculation, not wild gesticulation. Mr. Olson, please.
Thank you, Al, very much. Steve Olson with the Economic Strategy Institute. During the initial days of the global financial crisis, one of the key buzzwords we heard in and around the G20 was rebalancing, rebalancing, rebalancing. It seems that we really failed to get any traction on it and make any kind of concrete progress. So my question is, have we basically given up on rebalancing, or do we think it's still possible within the G20 or within other forums to make substantial progress on the issue of rebalancing?
Who would like to? Yes.
Well, rebalancing isn't up to the G20. Rebalancing is up to a set of price signals that will encourage resource flows that will lead to rebalancing. And we have the answer in brief is we've seen partial rebalancing and not quite in the way we necessarily expected. But you heard in the last session quite a lot of talk about, for example, China being driven more by domestic demand. That is rebalancing. But the biggest prices that lead to rebalancing are exchange rates. We've seen some movement in exchange rates, but there's plenty of people in this room who are from countries or economies with exchange rates that aren't in what the IMF would at least think is in balance. And you're not going to get full rebalancing while there are still those distortions around.
Any other panelists would like to add to that? Right, thank you very much. Any other thoughts, comments? Well, since the crowd seems to be low, yes, please.
Maybe I can add something on rebalancing, since I already raised it in the previous session in regard to China. I mean, it's already happening in China. You know, wages going up, the domestic economy developing, partly as a policy decision, but partly because that's the way things have to develop. And the same thing in the United States, which was the flip side of the rebalancing call. It was a deficit economy. Well, they have adjusted. So I think it's not for G20, certainly. It's for each economy. Those that were most away from a balanced order on one side or the other have found it appropriate to correct. There are still calls for example, for Germany to expand. Well, that's rebalancing. But I think it's up to each country to do what is best for them.
Dr. Sy?
Well, all I would say is that right now the focus seems to be on the recovery of global demand, because we need that for recovery to be sustained. The next issue is to make sure this is sustained over time. And I think for Asia, this is very important, because for Asia to remain a growth leader, it needs to change its growth model, and that's what they call rebalancing too. But there are two issues. First is we need global demand to recover, and then we have to talk about how we develop a sustainable growth strategy. I think people are more on the first stage right now.
Yes, please, Alicia. Microphone, please.
Just a comment on tapering, and we're here, Anup seen, kind of cautioning about what may happen and why this is, of course, a very important issue for the G20. But I like to kind of tone down a little. I don't know whether it was worried or just the fact that everything has to be coordinated. But if it was worried, I would be more relaxed about what may happen in the emerging world. In as far as, yes, we had, spike of fear back last year, especially before the summer, but we've seen flows coming back, and I actually think that still growth differential is very important in favor of the emerging world. So I would actually think that what's going to happen in terms of withdrawal of liquidity is actually a good thing for the whole emerging world, and we still have huge infrastructure needs that we need to cover down here in the emerging world, maybe not Hong Kong, but elsewhere, which will still attract capital. So I think overall, I think this is quite a positive thing. Maybe if we manage to do it without, basically uncoordination or maybe uninformation of unexpected moves. But other than that, I think we should be relatively fine.
Dr. Singh, would you like to respond?
Well, I kind of agree with what you said. I think what you are saying implicitly says that emerging markets need to develop policy frameworks that attract capital as foreign direct investment into what is needed for growth. The problem has been that the capital has come into sectors that have increased the vulnerability into property and financial imbalances. So I think the issue is on both sides. On the one side, you've got unconventional monetary policies leading to a volatility in capital, for which some countries believe there needs to be much more coordination, much more information, much more discussion. On the other side, it is, as you think, I think you're saying, equally important that the burden is on emerging markets that need infrastructure to ensure that this capital, if it flows out of the vulnerable sectors, it's fine. It needs to come back in the sustainable sectors. So I think you're right on both points of view.
Thank you very much. Yes, there's a question over here.
Peter Harbers with Hong Kong Aviation Capital. If one would believe the newspapers in Europe, there is a sentiment about the role Russia is taking at the moment, in particular with its neighbors. Is the panel's view that this is a one-time blip, or is this meaning that G8 becomes G7, G20 becomes G19, BRIC becomes big? What is the panel's view on that?
Any thoughts? Oh, there's a lot of passing of the buck here. No, okay.
I'm going to be brave. That is a very interesting question. Certainly, I mean, what the G8, former G8 now, G7, well, what the G7 decides to do is, of course, up to the G7. With respect to the G20, I think certainly the view that Australia is taking is that it is principally an economic forum. The G20 finance ministers and central bank governors noted the possible risks arising from what is happening in Ukraine for the global economy. But I think, I mean, the idea of expelling Russia from the G20 is, we're a very, very long way from contemplating that at this stage. And I think certainly the BRICS have shown no inclination to become the BICs. So I think, apart from the fact that it just doesn't sound as good, so I think...
Not as solid.
Well, yeah, exactly. But I think, I mean, obviously everybody is watching with great interest and trepidation what is happening in that part of the world, and particularly the Europeans, for very obvious reasons. But I think we're a long way from seeing a withdrawal of Russia from international institutions.
If I could just put in my 2 cents worth, if you look back at, say, the troubles in East Timor that came around the time of the APEC meeting in New Zealand some years ago, you know, Indonesia was part of APEC, but it's an economic organization, economic forum. And so Indonesia, there was no talk of, you know, barring Indonesia from the meeting. There was a question, however, as to whether the APEC forum was the appropriate place to discuss East Timor. And so there was a side meeting in East Timor, which technically speaking, the Indonesians did not attend, although they did attend. They had somebody there, but there was nobody there, if you know what I mean. So we must, that's, I think, a good precedent to think about. Any other thoughts? There's another question here, I think. The lady, yes.
Hi, Susan Madden, USC. You talked earlier, actually, Dr. Bollard, about the role of the U.S. Fed in other central banks. Do you see any long-term implications on the U.S. Treasury's FATCA legislation now in the foreign direct investment? Or is that just going to be a blip on the screen?
Sorry, can you say that?
The impact of FATCA, which is on foreign direct investment. Do you think there'll be a tightening? No answer.
All right, sorry. Yes. Unless anybody else wanted to. Yes, please.
Bennett Chang, Lingnan University. I want to follow up on that question, and that is, what do you think about the political conflicts or friction between the G20 members, Russia versus EU and the US on one hand, China versus Japan and the US on the other hand, also with some military overtones, will have impact on their seriousness to work together with one common objective for G20?
Janaline, it's maybe?
Yeah, I think, I mean, as I said, I think the G20 sees itself as principally an economic forum, and one of the good things about that is that it provides everybody an opportunity to put aside their political differences and actually work together for a common economic cause. And I think what we're hoping in our host year is that that common economic cause will be about growth, and it will be about, specifically about removing some of the impediments to growth that we have in our own economies. And I think, you know, whatever China and Japan might say to each other in a sort of foreign policy space, or whatever Russia and the EU might say to each other, I think certainly we all share a common desire to see economic improvement in our own countries and global economic improvement. So I think the G20 is actually an opportunity to overcome some of those foreign policy differences and actually work together constructively.
Other questions? Other questions? What I then propose, if there are no more questions, is to just have each of the panelists maybe 1 or 2 sentences, just to sort of your own conclusions from the discussion. If I might start with Dr. Bollard, and then we'll work our way back.
Yes, the world's an untidy place, and it would be nice if we could tidy it up, but that's not often realistic. The way we see it in the Pacific is in terms of a big noodle bowl of interlapping arrangements, and I think that's always going to be the case. Let's spare a thought, though, for too many organisations with too many expectations of too many finance ministers and trade ministers, because they're not all going to go to them. So in my view, regional and international organisations need to be realistic about what they can achieve. We all need to try and ensure that the agendas for those organisations are the appropriate ones for those organisations, and we all keep pushing ahead to continue what this region here has seen, which is the biggest growth that the world has ever seen and the most people improving their living standards as has ever happened in the history of the world. And for me, that's what it's all about.
Thank you. Dr. Singh.
Let me say something on an optimistic note to my last comments. I think there's a lot of consensus around the world that the reason why it's taken the world so long to move out of the global crisis of 2008 is because private demand, agri-demand, is taking a long time to pick up. And that is why we have all these unconventional policies around us. And I think the focus of G20 and all other institutions is to do what everybody can through coordination of policies for private demand to pick up. And I would say that focus is why I think we should believe that the question that was asked in the last few minutes, the focus is on getting demand to recover, getting global growth to recover. I think there is a consensus that that needs to happen, and that's what we should all focus on.
Thank you. Dr. Siade.
Yeah, let me come back to the issue that you put to me, which is WTO. I think another factor why the world of trade is in complete disarray, that I didn't mention before, is completely bureaucratic. In finance, you have finance ministers and central bankers, and they are in charge, and there's no question about that. So they can meet and they run the show, okay? In the IMF, in the G20, finance, and so on. The world of trade is a lot more complicated. You have trade ministers, and then sometimes it's not trade ministers, but foreign ministers. And then these are the spokesmen, because in reality the substance is under the Secretary of Energy and the Secretary of Communications and the Finance Secretary. So that makes it a lot more rudderless, more like almost headless. And so bureaucratically, they are less able to negotiate and to deliver. And that's why you need leadership. That's why I really think that something like the G20, that maybe every year, or at least every second year, doubles a little bit with trade. There's a little item on the agenda in the discussions, but it's very marginal. I think it should become more central, because presidents and heads of government is only one per country. And these are the ones that really should pull things together and say, we need to do something with the non-Doha round and with the world of trade. That is very important.
Thank you. Janaline.
I might just continue on that. To say that I think one of the things that we are hoping to achieve in our presidency of the G20 is to have people focus on trade, but not in terms of trading off concessions, which is essentially the modus operandi of the WTO, but in terms of what we do domestically to make trade flow more freely within our own countries and from our own countries and to our own countries. And I think that is where leaders really can deliver. And, you know, I really hope that taking this different approach, where we're not talking about I'm getting a concession from you and trading it off for another concession, we're not thinking about it in those terms. We're thinking about how trade can benefit me, Australia, or the United States or Argentina. So it is therefore in my interests to remove these barriers, to make things better for my own economy and my own people. And if the G20 can achieve that, I think it will really have come a long way to shoring up its international legitimacy. And of course, it does all come back to economic growth.
Thank you very much. If I might just wrap up with a couple of comments. One is that, we've talked about the limitations at the global level, global governance. There are great opportunities, but clearly, having a global organization like the WTO, or even a smaller one like the G20, maybe in times of crisis, you can come together and embrace and cooperate in a coordinated way. But then when the recovery comes, the embrace is much less tight. and the ability to coordinate much more difficult. Now, at the regional level, maybe you can do more, particularly with a smaller group of countries. So APEC is maybe a good example. But again, here, APEC is a voluntary organization, it's non-binding. So there are issues. This is really a model for achieving results with global issues. So that's why I think the discussion that we've had today is incredibly important, because maybe it's at the city level that we really should be looking at the city level where the action is. Maybe it's cities working together, cities working in groups, cities within regions. Maybe that's where the solutions can really happen. And then you can maybe scale them up to regional level. I teach global studies at the University of Hong Kong, and I always end my global studies workshops saying, maybe we've been doing the wrong thing the whole semester, talking about global this, global that, and global solutions. Maybe what we should be doing, to borrow from Barack Obama, is talk about community organizing, community studies, how to work to find solutions at a municipal level, even maybe lower, or at sub-regional levels. And that might be more effective. The second point I would make is about leadership. It's been mentioned here. And sometimes, we talk about leadership, and we sometimes think about abstracts of nation-state leadership, the United States taking leadership, or China taking leadership. But at the end of the day, it's about the people, right? Do the people who are the leaders, do they have a global perspective or not? And I think a big question here in Hong Kong that we're confronted with is that our leaders have to face a very complex situation where they're not just looking at the domestic and the national, as in most sort of nation states, but they're looking domestic, national, global, regional. We have very complex governance requirements of our leaders. So, sometimes I think we're too hard on them, but it's a very complex place to govern despite its small size. And so I would say that what's important for Hong Kong in some ways is not to sort of look too much at the domestic situation, political situation, or the relationship with the mainland, but really to be international, to be truly global. And that's the question we should ask in Hong Kong. Are we indeed truly global? I'm heartened by the fact that I've been spending the whole week talking to each of my students. I interview each of my students individually before the end of the semester. And I have to say, I can report that each and every one of them has a global perspective. So I'm heartened by the presence of many students here, which is a testament to the good work of the Asia Society. It's very important that young people get that global perspective. And I think this conference has helped to that effect. So thank you very much. I turn now to Ronnie Chan. And thank you very much to, of course, our panelists.